We are here today because Black employees who face decades of discrimination in the federal public service turned to the courts for redress, and the government moved to dismiss their claims, telling workers to turn to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. This month, the government ruled that the Canadian Human Rights Commission was discriminating against its own Black employees. Race-based complaints were being dismissed at a much higher rate than non-race-based complaints. It is now a fact that workers cannot turn to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, a commission that is plagued with discrimination, for redress. It is time to stop the hurt and pain inflicted on workers. Last year, the Prime Minister apologized to the descendants of Black Canadians for anti-Black hate and discrimination to their ancestors over 100 years ago while trying to serve in Canada during the First World War. The anti-Black hate and discrimination continues today. Today, Mr. Prime Minister, you can address the present pain and suffering of workers. We don't need another 100 years for another apology. This is happening now, and you have the power to fix it. It is time to settle the class action. By virtue of the incredible team that has joined me this morning, this is an extremely important announcement. And this is an extremely important moment for Black Canadian workers and all Canadians who value the ideal of a fair, equal, and just workplace that is free from harassment and injuries. My name is Nicholas Marcus Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Black Class Action Secretariat. My organization represents thousands of Black federal public service employees in a monumental class action lawsuit filed against the Government of Canada for discriminating against them for decades. I am joined today by union leaders representing over 3 million workers in Canada. Larry Rousseau, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress, Chris Aylward, National President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, Alex Silas, Regional Executive Vice President for the National Capital Region of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, and Jennifer Carr, who's the National President of the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada. We've united together to fight for a better Canada, where the dreams of multiculturalism, equity, and merit-based systems becomes a reality for all Canadians. This government reminds Canadians, and indeed the world community, that keeping people safe is always its top priority. Our work at the Secretariat and the lawsuit is about Canadian workers, Black Canadian citizens, and the urgent and pressing need to keep them safe by bringing an end to the hurt and harm that Black employees continue to face in federal workplaces. I have the unenviable task of speaking out loud today in front of you to what thousands of current and past Black employees tell us every day of the discrimination, hate, harm, and indifference they face by way too many managers, executives, and departments. We're here because too many still feel afraid of reprisals for just exercising their democratic right to say out loud the trauma that they face and the real wages that they have lost over the many years and worse, severe workplace discrimination. Each worker has a story and the mental scars to show. This morning I can reference an educated Black woman with a university degree being hired in the 80s in a CR2 position, which is an entry-level position, and never moving past that, when at the same time there are more than a few associate deputy ministers at the highest ranks of the public service, and at least one deputy minister with barely a high school diploma. This is not fair and certainly not Canadian. Democratic governments like Canada make speeches to others about how we should behave to fix our institutional problems. When a government had started the wrong, we saw it with the purge case, and we saw it in the residential school tragedies. The government can step up and solve this problem. They can end the hurt and harm. The Canadian Human Rights Commission is a key organization that is supposed to support Canada's responsibility, both domestic law and international treaties, such as the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This ruling by the government confirms that workers cannot turn to the Commission for redress, and it is harming its own workers, and it is discriminatory. As a matter of fact, its workers have told Canadians not to turn to the Commission because it is a toxic workplace and their race-based complaint is likely to be rejected. And it is very ironic that the Treasury Board, which issued this ruling, that the Commission discriminated against Black employees, but the Treasury Board itself, Black employees say they're facing discrimination working on the government's mental health program to address racial trauma. Treasury Board recently fired Black employees after they raised concerns of anti-Black racism. And to put that into perspective, the Treasury Board is the employer for the majority of the federal public service. It has been over 2 years since Black employees filed this class action, and the government's constant position was to trust the process. Trust the systems in place to bring fair resolutions. We knew then what all of you have learned last week, which is that these institutions are themselves indifferent to the hurt and harm of Black Canadians and other marginalized employees. These systems are unable to address the rampant scourge of anti-Black racism and discrimination across the public service, as those who've carried out these acts are now responsible for creating and implementing the solutions needed. Workers feel helpless and re-victimized again, and they have nowhere to turn to for redress other than the courts. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Justice Minister David Lametti, the Clerk of the Privy Council, your government's actions against Black public service employees is un-Canadian and goes against all of the principles that Canadians cherish. You have the power to stop the hurt and harm today. To those working on Black files, such as the UN Decade for People of African Descent, Associate Deputy Minister Malakana, Associate Deputy Minister Andrew Brown, Deputy Justice Minister Shailene Curtis McAuliffe, as well as the Parliamentary Black Caucus and all members of Parliament, we bring to your attention the continuing hurt and harm that is inflicted on Black Canadian workers. You have a positive obligation to speak out and to act today. The Outstanding Employment Equity Act review by Professor Adele Blackett. We need this long overdue report to be made public right away. We're asking the Government of Canada to come to the table with us immediately and to resolve this class action within the next 60 days, rather than spending millions of taxpayer dollars to force Black public service workers to relive their pain through aggressive cross-examination by government lawyers. Our organization over the next few weeks will be convening a national conversation to provide workers with an update on where we are and our plans moving forward. I'll now turn the microphone over to the National President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, Chris Aylward.
Thank you, Nicholas. Good morning, everyone. Certainly the recent admission by Treasury Board confirms what our members have been telling us for a long time. Systemic discrimination runs so deep in Canada's public service that it can be even found in the very branch of government that's responsible for fighting it. This should outrage every single Canadian. That when discrimination is found within the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the branch of the government that's responsible for uprooting and eradicating all forms of discrimination and racism within the public service, Canadians should be concerned. PSAC is unified with our members and fellow unions in calling for this government to stop stalling and make things right. The federal government keeps saying it is listening and that it's making changes, but it continues to speak out of both sides of its mouth. They claim they are trying to make public services more inclusive, but yet they denied our bargaining demand for mandatory discrimination training. They have declared that mental health is important to them, but they have terminated our members working on the Black Mental Health Action Plan and have dismissed our requests for transparency and accountability. They say they are taking anti-Black racism seriously, but have spent 2 years trying to dismiss our members' class action in court. Enough is enough. The time for lip service is over. Our members do not want the government's empty words or empty promises. They want justice. Because we know these systemic issues not only affect Black workers, especially Black women, but also Indigenous and other racialized workers as well. And the issues are compounded because of gender. If you have a disability or a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, PSAC is taking strike votes for 155,000 of our members just down the hall. Our members are casting votes on key bargaining demands around fair wages, better working conditions, and workplace free of discrimination and racism. This is a key bargaining issue, and we will not settle for anything less. We will continue to support the Black Class Action. We will continue to push for anti-racism workplaces for all of our Black, Indigenous, and racialized workers. And we will continue to use the full force of our bargaining power to hold this government to account until they truly create an equitable and diverse public service for all.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci d'être ici avec nous. Je m'appelle Alex Lard, je suis le vice-président exécutif régional pour la FPC ici dans la région de la capitale nationale. Ce qui s'est passé à la Commission des droits de la personne, c'est la preuve de ce que les travailleurs et travailleuses disent depuis trop longtemps, que le racisme systémique est si profond dans la fonction publique du Canada que même dans la branche tâchée pour contrer le racisme, on y trouve les pires exemples. Et ça devrait être très préoccupant, très bouleversant pour tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes que ça se passe à ces niveaux-là du gouvernement fédéral. La FPC est unie avec les travailleurs et travailleuses, avec l'Institut professionnel, avec les autres syndicats de la fonction publique fédérale, pour dire au gouvernement de cesser de retarder et de refuser les demandes du recours collectif noir, de donner la justice aux travailleurs et travailleuses noirs, racisés et autochtones, et de faire le travail nécessaire pour véritablement créer de la fonction publique fédérale des milieux de travail plus inclusifs, plus équitables et plus représentatifs de la population que nous servons. Le gouvernement aime ça, les belles paroles, les gros mots. Monsieur Trudeau, Madame Fortier, ils aiment ça utiliser des gros mots à 10 piastres. Mais la vérité, c'est qu'ils n'écoutent pas. La vérité, c'est quand on se plaint, on se fait jeter dehors. La vérité, c'est qu'ils parlent des deux bords de la bouche. D'un bord, ils disent, oui, ils veulent prioriser l'antiracisme, créer des milieux de travail plus inclusifs. Mais de l'autre bord, ils refusent même de discuter de notre demande d'une formation en matière de discrimination dans la fonction publique fédérale. D'un bord, ils disent, oui, la santé mentale, c'est une priorité pour notre gouvernement. De l'autre bord, ils mettent à pied les travailleurs qui, justement, travaillent sur le plan de santé mentale. D'un bord, ils disent qu'ils prennent ça au sérieux, le racisme anti-noir. Mais ça fait 2 ans qu'ils essayent de rejeter et de refuser le recours collectif. Assez, c'est assez. On a fini des belles paroles, ça prend de l'action. C'est le temps que le gouvernement règle nos griefs, règle le recours collectif et donne justice aux travailleurs et travailleuses et afin d'avancer pour créer une fonction publique fédérale anti-raciste sans discrimination. Nous, à l'AFPC, on va continuer à soutenir le recours collectif, on va continuer à soutenir nos membres, on va continuer à exiger des milieux de travail plus inclusifs, plus équitables pour les travailleurs noirs, autochtones et racisés. Et on va continuer à utiliser toute notre force de pouvoir, de négociation, pour exiger que ce gouvernement ici crée réellement une fonction publique fédérale plus inclusive. On est en vote de grève présentement pour 155 000 travailleurs et travailleuses. C'est la plus grande unité de négociation dans le pays. Et la formation antiraciste, c'est une priorité pour les membres de l'AFPC dans cette ronde de négociation. Donc, comme qui se passe souvent, quand on parle de progrès dans notre société, si les employeurs, les gouvernements et les politiciens comme M. Trudeau et Mme Fortier ne vont pas s'y adresser, ben c'est les travailleurs et travailleuses qui vont se retrousser les manches, se serrer les coudes, se tenir solidaires et faire le travail qu'il faut faire pour faire avancer ce progrès important et créer non seulement des milieux de travail, mais aussi une société plus inclusive et plus équitable et prendre en main la lutte contre le racisme. Merci beaucoup. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jennifer Carr, and I am the proud president of the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada. We represent over 70,000 public service professionals, mainly in the federal government. We have been a supporter of the Black Class Action lawsuit from day one. It's sad that we have to be here. It's because discrimination, racism, and lack of timely and effective action are something that is becoming the norm within this government. I've heard that the government has decided that this is a collective bargaining issue, that they want to take it to the Federal Public Service Labor Relations Board. But I can tell you that that board is ineffective and inefficient. We talk about turning people's lives upside down, waiting 5 years to have your case before a judge. And what happens is you get personal justice. You don't get systemic justice. There's no way for the government to change its ways or manners when it relies on each individual person to come forward with their own story and ask for their own personal justice. And that's why we support this class action. There's a long-standing history of alienation among BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, and people of colors in the public service that needs to be recognized and addressed. This legal action shines a bright light on that very issue. The statistics don't lie. We are able to show that the hiring and the promotion of Black federal servants is not at the same rate as any other BIPOC or employment equity group. Concerning to me, myself, is 3/4 of the women, 3/4 of the people in the class action at this moment are Black women. Black women who deserve justice, who have been systemically denied promotions, have been denied the ability to provide for their families and have dignity as a federal public servant. This is a vital step towards fostering a more inclusive and equitable environment. And those are the words you continually hear from this government. A diverse and inclusive government. My members are tired of performative. They're tired of words. We need to have actual actions that take and address the concerns seriously and bring things forward so that we can have real restitution. It's our collective responsibility to ensure that every individual is treated with fairness, respect, and dignity. We must address the systemic and root causes of any oppression that happens systemically within the government. So I'm here today to urge the government to stop their delay tactics, to realize and look at their own numbers. As an evidence-based organization, the numbers aren't lying. I ask that they work with the Black Class Action to bring equity and justice to the federal public service. I also urge the government to update its employment equity practices. We've had the Employment Equity Act for over 10 years, and we have seen little change in the stats. Again, a performative action without teeth means nothing. We'd like to establish some more rigor around the selection boards and inclusion of equity and other diverse groups to make sure that staffing is more fair and transparent. And we'd like to identify Black as its own separate employment equity criteria. These intersectionalities should be included so that we can help understand and organize the way that we look at hiring within the government, but not only hiring, but promotion as well as demotion or firing. The employment equity plans need to have an accountability framework, because right now we have many departments and agencies who have failed to meet their employment equity targets year after year after year. And if the government takes this seriously, they need to act on that. It is responsibility of the government to do what it says. And right now it's time for action. The representation of employment equity seeking groups in the federal workplace cannot improve in the current context. Decisive and immediate action must be taken to finally create a federal public service and workplace that reflects the population of the people of Canada and their values. It's time for them to come to the table and talk so that we can settle this action and provide some justice to those who have been denied justice for so long. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Larry Russo. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. We represent 55 unions across Canada, and that represents over 3 million workers across the country. The Canadian Labour Congress and Canada's unions stand in solidarity with Black workers against all forms of racial discrimination. Anti-Black racism and discrimination are deeply embedded in our Canadian institutions, policies, workplaces, and society. Let me make this very clear. This is not just a public sector issue, it also is a private sector issue. All sectors of Canadian society. The social and economic consequences of this have been dire for Black people, resulting in multi-generational wage gap for members of Black communities across the country. This is an injustice that must be set right in every sector of our economy and in every workplace. Les impacts du racisme anti-noir sont extrêmement sévères et importants et ont causé des barrières extrêmement importantes à l'avancement économique et social de la communauté noire au Canada. This has resulted in Black workers earning lower wages and facing obstacles in all aspects of work, from the initial hiring process to advancement and promotion and retention, and this must stop. Black workers in the federal public service have not been immune to these struggles, and as has clearly been demonstrated by the previous speakers, the traditional avenues to address discrimination and human rights violations have not been able to deliver much progress for these workers. For years now, we have been calling on the federal government for long-term concrete action to address systemic labor market discrimination and disadvantages faced by Black workers. And as a previous speaker said, enough is enough. Now is the time for the federal government to step up and do the right thing. That's why Canada's unions support the legal action taken against the Government of Canada on behalf of Black federal public service workers, past and present, who have experienced discrimination via discriminatory hiring and promotion practices. The Black Class Action lawsuit is a pathway to achieving not only justice, but meaningful change. So we strongly urge the federal government to uphold the human rights of its workers and redress the injustices faced by Black federal public service employees. I would like to thank the Black Class Action lawsuit, as well as Nicholas Thompson for his initiative and his team for the work that has been done, and for making sure that the Canadian Labour Congress is part of this process. And we will stand with you, as well as all Black workers and racialized workers across the country, in order to achieve the justice which is long overdue. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you very much. We're also joined today by Brother Mark Briere, who is the National President of the Union of Taxation Employees, the union that represents over 37,000 workers at the Canada Revenue Agency. He's also here to support workers. CRA employees represents the largest group of class members from any particular department. It represents the largest amount of workers that are before the court. So we appreciate you joining us today. We can now take your questions.
Hi, yes, Damon Bird from CBC News. Does the government have a point, though, in their challenge to the proposed class action? They're saying that employees can seek redress through the Canadian Human Rights Commission. They can seek redress through filing a grievance, which is what happened at the commission. The employees filed a policy grievance, and the government was found to have discriminated against the employees. So does the government have a point there that, in this case, the system seemed to have worked?
Sure. Well, what is clear is that all of the institutions entrusted with protecting workers are actually violating those rights. As I mentioned earlier, the Treasury Board that issued this decision, workers at the Treasury Board are facing discrimination under the same office that issued this decision. The decision, while it is historic in making a declaration that the Human Rights Commission was discriminatory, there is no relief granted. Workers at the Commission are still facing discrimination. Their careers are still stagnant. They still have loss of pension. They still have loss of wages, and they still have significant pain and suffering. So while the words confirming the discrimination that we know existed at the Commission and throughout the public service, while that declaration is important, workers, through this process that the government pointed them to, still do not have relief.
So, just as a follow-up, help me understand how the class action, if it is successful, would be any different.
Sure. So the class action is seeking long-term solutions to addressing the issue in a very comprehensive way. And that is a key issue is how the public service has applied the Employment Equity Act. The legislation places all racialized groups into one category. And federal employers, when there's an employment equity gap, they have consistently applied employment equity in a manner that excludes Black employees. That is why the Employment Equity Act review and any accompanying measures to support that is critical. We're seeking for the first time a historic amendment to the legislation to create a designated category for Black people, separate from the visible minorities category. So federal employers can no longer hide behind the visible minorities category in excluding Black workers. So these are all measures that the class action is seeking. The government, when we filed this case, the government sought to amend the Employment Equity Act as we're seeking to strike it down as unconstitutional due to the discrimination that it is sanctioning within the public service, contrary to Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the court case, in addition, the mechanisms that are there are unable to grant the remedies that workers are seeking in the court. We have workers who've served Canada diligently for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and have retired in the same position, or is retiring in the same position. Their pension are impacted. Throughout their entire careers, their wages, the family, the generational impact to their families, the communities they live in, the education that they're able to provide their children, the generational impacts are significant. A grievance process is unable to grant those remedies. Any grievance process, or at the board, at the federal board, or at the so-called Canadian Human Rights Commission, they're unable to grant the remedies that are being sought in the lawsuit, which are comprehensive, which includes compensation for loss of salary, loss of pension, pain and suffering. How do you compensate someone for taking away their entire livelihood? People have retired with significant trauma. We've called on the government to establish this mental health program. We filed a motion in the court. They said, well, we're going to establish this. We'll settle this out of the court. And now workers on the mental health program are facing discrimination, creating a mental health program to address racial discrimination. It is never ending with this government. And that's why we believe that this is properly before the court, and that the solutions that can be provided under the remit of the court is the only pathway forward.
David, just to add to that, sorry.
Could you just move the mic? Yeah.
Sure. You've got, two of the largest federal public sector unions here in PSAC and the Provincial Institute. You've got the Canadian Labour Congress here. I mean, certainly all three of us support the grievance process, but this is much bigger than an individual grievance, or it's even much bigger than a policy grievance, for that matter as well. As Nicholas pointed to, this is so large, and we have to make sure that it encompasses everyone. So if we were to file a grievance, that would not pertain to people who have already left the public service, for example. So that's why we're supporting the Black Class Action as opposed to a grievance, because as Nicholas so rightfully said, the grievance process would not be able to encompass everything that we see that's going on here, for sure.
Yeah, that's pretty much along those same lines that I would say. So in the case of the policy grievance, this was launched by the Commission of Employees. It's a very small commission, so it's easy for them to bring something forward as a policy grievance. Imagine us putting a policy grievance against the Department of National Defense. That would be a totally different set of circumstances. The other thing is that when you go through the individual grievance route through the PSRB, those processes are 5 or 6 years. And at the end, most of the times, they just want to give you individual remedy. They're not looking and they're not seeking to find out the root causes. They're not looking and seeking to say, department, you need to do better. They're really just settling that individual grievance. And that's why the class action is important, is because it's going to force the government to those systemic changes that we can't get through any other means. Justice delayed, justice denied, but also the other thing is we can't grieve staffing and hiring processes. That is solely within the right of the employer. So when we're talking about why a certain class of workers is not moving forward, that really is within the federal government. And then of course it is about redress. It is about redress, and we need to make sure that not only people who are affected now, but those in the past and those in the future will have access to equitable and diverse hiring practices that allow them to have the same opportunities as every other employee in the federal public service.
I think it's important for us to also recognize, after what my colleagues have just said, it is very clear that the Black Class Action suit is looking at the systemic barriers that historically have stopped people from getting redress, proper redress. So if we look at that, we have to recognize as well that the current system simply doesn't work. I don't think that any of my colleagues would disagree with me that the current systemic procedures in place have been a resounding success to resolve the grievances of our members. It is often extremely costly, and we never get full satisfaction for our members. So, if the Black Class Action suit is bringing before the courts, the suit that it is bringing before the courts, I am extremely concerned, and we will be paying very close attention that the courts will recognize that we have a systemic failure, and that the only way to redress that systemic failure is by giving satisfaction to the suit itself. That would be a very important step. Thank you.
Do you speak French, Mr. Thompson? By chance?
I
Do you speak
don't.
French, by chance?
I don't.
No, okay, no worries. That's okay. I was wondering if Madame Carr et Monsieur Rousseau, si vous pouvez en fait nous dire c'est quoi en français, c'est quoi le message que vous voulez passer aujourd'hui et en quoi ce que le gouvernement propose avec les griefs, là, en quoi c'est pas suffisant.
Oui, donc selon moi, non, parce que tu me demandes de parler en français si j'ai pas les mots. C'est une question du équité. C'est une question du avoir des ressources ou des récompenses suffisantes pour le dommage, pour la peine qu'il fait pour les travailleurs noirs. Le système qu'on a maintenant, c'est un individu qui va venir devant l'adjudicateur pour avoir des récompenses, mais c'est seulement pour eux-mêmes. C'est pas pour un champ systémique, pour le département ou l'agence. Et pour nous, ça, c'est quelque chose qui est un gros défi, déficit dans le système. On ne peut pas changer le système systémique si on doit faire un par un. Donc, le collectif, c'est important pour faire un changement systémique, pour changer les politiques d'engagement, de donation, pour avoir les représentatifs qu'on a besoin dans le service public.
Merci.
Alors, pour la question du système actuel et pour régler les griefs et les problèmes de relations de travail en milieu de travail. Et cela va autant du côté secteur public que le secteur privé. Nous savons qu'il y a des failles très importantes dans le système. Alors, ce que nous sommes en train de dire, c'est que pourquoi utiliser un système qu'on sait d'avance ne peut-être donnera pas la pleine satisfaction. Comme mon ancien prof de droit m'a toujours dit en cours de droit, il a dit, Larry, un règlement vaut toujours mieux qu'un bon procès. OK? Parce qu'il n'y a que les avocats qui gagnent là-dedans. Ça coûte très cher. Et en bout de ligne, est-ce que les partis ont trouvé satisfaction? Certainement pas la partie des travailleurs et des travailleuses. Alors, ce que nous sommes en train de dire, c'est que le gouvernement reconnaisse que ce n'est pas dans le système actuel, par la procédure actuelle de redressement de griefs et de relations de travail, que nous allons trouver pleine satisfaction pour les travailleuses et les travailleurs noirs. D'accord? Il faut que le gouvernement reconnaisse qu'il faut changer les choses. Et c'est ça qu'on est en train de demander. Merci.
Je sais pas si M. Silence, vous avez bien répondu dans le communiqué, mais si vous avez autre chose à dire, c'est...
Merci. Oui, je pense que tu as pas mal eu la position de la FPC dans mon discours de tantôt, mais juste pour ajouter, la lutte contre le racisme systémique, c'est une lutte qu'il faut mener sur tous les fronts. C'est une lutte qu'il faut mener à travers le processus de grief, certainement, à travers des plaintes officielles à la Commission des droits de la personne, certainement, mais c'est une lutte qu'on doit aussi mener de façon politique et en mobilisation. C'est une lutte qu'il faut mener en négociation. C'est pour ça qu'on a une revendication, une de nos priorités, c'est une formation antiraciste à travers la fonction publique fédérale. Et c'est pour ça aussi qu'on mobilise nos membres sur cet enjeu critique. C'est pour ça qu'on voit des organisations se former comme le recours collectif. C'est clair, puis pour en revenir aussi, toucher sur la question d'avant aussi, c'est clair que le système ne marche pas pour les travailleurs et travailleuses. Le système marche pour maintenir le statu quo, mais le système ne marche pas pour faire avancer le progrès, pour faire avancer l'équité. L'AFPC et le mouvement syndical, on est commis dans la lutte contre le racisme systémique et on va utiliser tous les moyens qu'on peut pour faire avancer ce travail et pour contrer l'inéquité, la discrimination et le racisme dans toutes ses formes à la fonction publique fédérale, dans tous les secteurs et à travers notre société. C'est critiquement important. Puis ceux dans les positions de pouvoir qui pourraient faire quelque chose, présentement, ils font rien. Car là, on parle des travailleurs qui ont été demandés de travailler sur un projet spécial pour créer un fonds de santé mentale pour les travailleurs et travailleuses noirs dans la fonction publique fédérale. Majoritairement des femmes noires qui ont été demandées de travailler sur ce projet-là. En travaillant sur ce projet-là, ils ont subi du racisme, ils se sont plaints, ils ont soulevé le point, comme ils sont supposés de faire, puis la réaction de l'employeur, c'est de les jeter dehors. C'est pas fort, ça, là. C'est à ce point-là que les paroles du gouvernement ne suivent pas leur action. C'est grave. Puis on devrait être capable de s'attendre beaucoup mieux de notre gouvernement fédéral, du Conseil du Trésor, de Mme Fortier et de M. Trudeau.